December 18, 1944, just before dawn, a German tank crew sat on a frozen road in the Ardennes, listening to something they could not see. Not artillery, not aircraft, not tanks, trucks. A low, endless growl came through the trees. 6-cylinder engines, tire chains, loose cargo rattling in wooden beds. One German sergeant lifted his head above the ditch and counted the headlights before the driver killed them again. 1 pair, then another, then 10, then 30, then so many that counting became pointless. The Americans were supposed to be cut off. Their fuel dumps were supposed to be burning. Their roads were supposed to be blocked by snow, panic, and German armor. But the road was still alive. A shell landed beside the lead truck and threw mud over its windshield. The driver did not stop. The second truck swerved around the crater. The third pushed through a ditch and climbed back onto the road with 2 wheels in the air. The fourth truck carried gasoline. The fifth carried artillery shells. The sixth carried blood plasma and blankets. By the time the German machine gun opened up, the convoy had already split. Half the trucks scattered into the woods, half kept moving. And the thing that broke the German sergeant was not that one truck burned. It was that another truck immediately took its place. That was the moment he understood the real shape of the war. Germany had built monsters, tigers, Panthers, half-tracks with angled armor, engines polished like clockwork. America had built something uglier. A square-nosed, mud-colored, 6-wheeled truck that looked like it belonged on a farm road, the GMC CCKW, the Deuce, and a Hoff, a truck so ordinary that most history books treat it like background scenery. But background scenery does not move armies. This truck did. By 1945, more than 500,000 of these machines and their close cousins had rolled out of American factories. They carried ammunition, fuel, rations, radios, bridges, tires, wounded men, wet socks, replacement rifles, and entire futures through roads that German planners thought no army could keep open. And when German soldiers said the Americans never seemed to run out of anything, they were not talking about courage, they were talking about trucks. To understand why that mattered, you have to go back to the lie the world believed in 1940. The lie was simple. Germany was the motorized army. Newsreels made it look true. Panzers poured through France. Motorcycle scouts raced ahead. Armored cars raised dust on roads that still had French signposts standing beside them. Camera loved speed, and Germany understood cameras. But the camera did not stay long enough to film what came behind the tanks. Horses, thousands of them. Then tens of thousands. Then hundreds of thousands. Most of the German army still moved the old way. Boot leather, wagon wheels, animal muscle. In 1940, only a fraction of German divisions were fully motorized. The rest followed the armored spearheads on foot, dragging supplies through a war that was already pretending to be more modern than it really was. In France, the illusion survived because the campaign was short. The legs could keep up with the teeth. In Russia, the illusion died. Roads disappeared into mud. Horses collapsed in harness. Trucks built with precision parts broke on dirt tracks and waited for mechanics who never came. Fuel froze, spare parts vanished. Winter clothing sat in depots while soldiers wrapped newspaper around their feet outside Moscow. German armor could still strike. It could not stay supplied, and a tank without fuel is not a weapon. It is a steel statue. The German High Command kept trying to solve the problem with better spearheads, better tanks, better guns, better elite units. America looked at the same war and asked a less glamorous question. What good is a spearhead if the road behind it is dead? That question did not belong to one famous general. It belonged to quartermasters, engineers, factory managers, mechanics, drivers, and men. It belonged to people who understood that the next war would not be decided only by what could break through a line. It would be decided by what could keep moving after the breakthrough. So American planners did something almost insulting to military romance. They started designing the war around trucks. Not a perfect truck, not a beautiful truck, not a prestige machine for elite troops. A truck that could be built fast, repaired by exhausted mechanics, driven by 19-year-olds, overloaded by desperate officers, and still start in the rain. The GMC CCKW looked plain because plain was the point. A steel cab, a wooden cargo bed, 6 driven wheels, a 270 cubic inch engine that was not exotic, not delicate, and not interested in making engineers feel brilliant. It was built to haul 2.5 tons. Too much fuel, too many shells, too many men, too many crates lashed down with rope by drivers who had not slept properly in 3 days. And it kept going. If a part failed, another truck usually had the same part. If a tire blew, the convoy did not become a memorial. Men changed it in mud, cursed the weather, and moved on. If the road broke, engineers threw planks over the hole, and the trucks crossed anyway. This was not genius in the dramatic sense. It was genius in the useful sense. Germany built machines that demanded respect. America built machines that forgave abuse. That difference became visible after Normandy. June 1944 began with ships, beaches, paratroopers, and blood. But the war after the beaches became a road problem. The Allies landed supplies faster than they could move them inland. The German front cracked. American armored divisions drove into France so quickly that their greatest enemy began to look less like a German soldier and more like an empty fuel can. Every mile of advance stretched the supply line. Every liberated town added another road junction to protect. Every tank that lunged forward needed gasoline. Every artillery battery needed shells. Every infantry company needed food, socks, morphine, batteries, maps, and mail. A commander could draw arrows on a map, but the arrow did not move unless a truck driver moved it. By late August 1944, the Allied armies were outrunning their own beaches. Fuel was sitting in Normandy. The front was racing toward Germany. Between the two was France. Destroyed bridges, crowded villages, roads choked by refugees, wrecked tanks, military police, dust, rain, dead animals, and traffic jams so long that men fell asleep standing beside their vehicles. The answer was the Red Ball Express. It was not glamorous, it was not clean. It was a massive emergency trucking system built across France almost overnight. One-way roads going forward, different roads coming back. Red circles painted on signs. Military police waving convoys through intersections, mechanics working in roadside pits, drivers sleeping in bursts so short they felt like hallucinations. At its peak, thousands of trucks ran day and night, hauling thousands of tons of supplies toward the front. Many of the men behind those wheels were black soldiers serving in a segregated army that still doubted them, restricted them, under-promoted them, and then depended on them to keep the war alive. That is one of the ugliest truths inside this story. The army that would not treat those drivers as equal citizens still trusted them with the bloodstream of the campaign. A rifleman at the front might never know the name of the man who delivered his ammunition. A tank commander might never see the driver whose gasoline made tomorrow's attack possible. But if that driver failed, the whole front felt it. So the drivers learned the road by memory. They learned which bridges groaned under too much weight, which villages had children who ran too close to the wheels, which turns collected German shell fire, which ditches hid broken axles, which tires could survive another 50 miles, and which ones were lying. Private Isaiah Walker was the kind of driver the army needed, and barely. He was 22 years old, from outside Birmingham, and he had learned engines before he learned the army's version of respect. Back home, he had kept farm trucks alive with wire, grease, and patience. In France, that same skill became military power. His truck did not have a name painted on the door. It had dents, a cracked mirror, a canvas seat patched twice, a cargo bed that smelled of gasoline no matter what it carried. On September 7, 1944, Walker's convoy left a depot before sunrise with fuel cans stacked so high that the men joked the truck was carrying its own funeral. Nobody laughed very long. They were told the front needed the fuel by nightfall. That was all. No speeches, no heroic music, just a clipboard, a route number, and a road that had already killed men. The convoy drove without headlights through the dark, following strips of white paint on the truck ahead. If that truck vanished, the road vanished with it. At dawn the dust started. By noon, every man's face looked the same color. By evening, the men were swallowing grit with their rations and hearing engines even when the engines stopped. Then the convoy hit the narrow road outside a ruined village near Chartres. A German aircraft came in low. The first burst ditched the road. The third truck in line jerked sideways and slammed into a wall. Fuel cans burst open. Fire ran along the ditch like spilled daylight. For 1 second everyone froze. Not from cowardice. From calculation, fuel fire on a narrow road meant the convoy could stop. If the convoy stopped, the tanks waiting 80 miles away stopped. If the tanks stopped, tomorrow's attack stopped. And if tomorrow's attack stopped, men who had never heard of this road would die because this road failed. Walker swung his truck left. 2 wheels left the road. The cargo shifted so hard that the rear springs screamed. His assistant driver grabbed the dashboard and yelled something Walker never heard. The GMC dropped into the ditch, climbed out, hit the road again, and kept moving. Behind him, the next driver followed. Then the next, then the next. The burning truck became a marker, not a wall. That was the Red Ball Express in one image, a road on fire. A line of trucks refusing to accept that fire had the final word. By midnight, the fuel reached the forward dump. Nobody there asked what the road had cost. They were too busy pouring gasoline into tanks. This was the part German commanders struggled to understand. They could destroy trucks. They did destroy trucks. They bombed roads, shelled crossroads, cut bridges, laid mines, shot at convoys from hedgerows and woods. But destruction did not produce the result they expected, because the American system was not built around one irreplaceable machine. It was built around flow. A truck burned. Another truck rolled. A bridge broke. Engineers built a bypass. A driver collapsed from exhaustion. Another driver slid behind the wheel. A depot emptied. Ships unloaded more. Germany fought the vehicle. America built the system around the vehicle. That is why the deuce and a half mattered. Not because it could survive everything. It could not. Not because it was comfortable. It was miserable. The cab was cold. The steering was heavy. The brakes could terrify a man on a downhill road. The engine noise crawled into your skull and stayed there. Drivers fell asleep at the wheel. Convoys collided in blackout conditions. Men died under cargo, in ditches, under aircraft, on bridges, and in the blind stupidity of roads too crowded to forgive one mistake. There was nothing romantic about it, but there was power in it. The power was repeatability. Every truck was not a miracle. It was one unit in a chain long enough to wrap around a continent. And a chain like that changes what commanders think is possible. Before trucks, an infantry division moved at the speed of feet and hunger. With trucks, a division could be shifted, supplied, pulled back, refitted, and thrown forward again before the enemy's map officers finished drawing the new line. Before trucks, a tank without fuel dictated the boundary of the attack. With trucks, fuel could chase the tank. Before trucks, wounded men waited for stretchers and luck. With trucks, roads became evacuation routes. The war was still brutal, but the distance between need and help began to shrink. The Germans saw the result before they understood the mechanism. Reports from the Western Front kept saying the same thing in different words. American units appeared faster than expected. American artillery fired longer than expected. American tanks recovered from fuel shortages faster than expected. American infantry had hot food, ammunition, and replacements with a regularity that felt obscene to men who were boiling horse meat and counting rifle cartridges. To German eyes, the Americans looked wasteful. They left cans, crates, tires, tarps, tools, and vehicles in quantities that seemed impossible. But what looked like waste was often the visible edge of abundance. A German unit lost a truck and felt the wound for weeks. An American unit lost a truck and filed a report. That was the difference. One side experienced breakdown as crisis. The other experienced breakdown as maintenance. Then came the Ardennes. December 1944. Hitler's last great gamble in the West was built on a fantasy of speed. German armored columns would smash through the American line, cross the forests, seize bridges, reach the Meuse, split the Allies, and force the world to bargain. But under the fantasy sat a much uglier truth. The offensive did not have enough fuel to become what it promised. German planners knew it. Commanders knew it. Drivers knew it. Some tanks entered the attack carrying fuel drums on their decks like desperate men carrying water into a desert. The plan depended on capturing American gasoline. Think about that for a moment. The last great German offensive in the West depended on stealing the enemy's logistics system while destroying the enemy's army. That is not confidence. That is confession. At first the attack worked. Fog covered the skies. Snow slowed movement. American units were surprised, split, surrounded, and forced back. Roads filled with refugees and retreating troops. German spearheads punched west with terrifying speed. For 72 hours, the war seemed to remember 1940. Then the old problem returned. Tanks drank fuel, roads clogged, bridges broke hoarse, drawn supply columns fell behind. German trucks went dry. The armored fist kept reaching. The arm behind it could not feed the fingers, and on the other side of the line, American trucks were already doing what they had been built to do. They moved reserves. They moved shells. They moved medical supplies. They moved fuel through weather that kept aircraft grounded, and through roads that looked like they belonged to another century. When Bastogne became the knot in the road system, trucks helped make the defense possible. They brought men toward the town before the ring closed. Inside the perimeter, every working vehicle became a lifeline. A truck that could not break out could still carry ammunition from one side of town to another. A truck could pull wounded men away from a shell crater. A truck could drag a gun into position. A truck could turn 4 minutes into the difference between reinforcement and collapse. Outside Bastogne, German units were trying to choke the roads. Inside Bastogne, American vehicles were proving that even encirclement had to fight the clock. And when the skies finally cleared, supplies came down from aircraft. But supplies on the ground are only supplies if somebody moves them. Men collected bundles, loaded trucks, hauled ammunition forward, hauled wounded back, spread food, medical packets, mortar rounds, and radio batteries through a perimeter that could not afford delay. The truck did not replace courage. It delivered courage to the place where courage was needed. By the time Patton's relief column broke through from the south, the pattern was unmistakable. German armor was powerful. American movement was continuous. The Germans could create shock. The Americans could absorb shock and reorganize faster than German planning allowed. That difference did not fit into the old language of glory. It sounded like engines on frozen roads. It smelled like gasoline on gloves. It looked like a black driver in a segregated army gripping a steering wheel while an officer who would not share a lunch counter with him depended on him to keep a tank battalion alive. It looked like a mechanic replacing a fuel pump in sleet with numb fingers. It looked like a truck bed filled with shells for guns whose crews had been told they were nearly out. It looked like replacement tires stacked beside a road because someone somewhere understood that even victory gets flats. In January 1945, as the bulge collapsed, German soldiers walked past vehicles they could no longer move, tanks with fuel gauges at 0, half-tracks abandoned in snow, guns without tractors, trucks cannibalized for parts that still did not make the rest of the column live. Then American trucks came down the same roads, not triumphantly, not cleanly. They came dirty, overloaded, dented, and loud. They carried the things that turn a battlefield from a crisis back into a front: fuel, food, ammunition, engine oil, wounded men under blankets, letters from home. The German soldiers watching them did not need a lecture in industrial warfare. They were seeing it. This is the part that later generations misunderstand. They look for the decisive machine and choose the most dramatic one. The Tiger tank, the Sherman, the Mustang, the B-17, the atomic bomb, all of them mattered. But wars are not only won by the machine that destroys. They are won by the machine that returns tomorrow. A tank wins a battle when it fires. A truck wins a campaign when it arrives again. And again after the war, the deuce. And half did not become a legend the way glamorous weapons became legends. It became useful. That was its curse and its honor. Thousands stayed in service. Thousands went to allies. Thousands were rebuilt, sold, worked, modified, forgotten, and used until their paint vanished under new purpose. Farmers drove them. Fire crews converted them. Small armies kept them running because simple machines have a second life that prestige machines rarely earn. The truck had done its work too well to remain sacred. It became ordinary again. But for the men who had waited at the front for fuel, ordinary never meant small. For a tank crew, ordinary was the difference between moving and becoming a target. For an artillery battery, ordinary was the difference between firing and silence. For an infantryman in frozen clothes, ordinary was a blanket, a ration crate, a ride away from the aid station. For a wounded soldier, ordinary was a truck bed and a driver who knew the road. And for the drivers themselves, ordinary was sometimes the only medal they received. Private Isaiah Walker went home in 1946. He did not return to a country transformed by gratitude. He returned to bus stations, job lines, neighborhoods, and rules that still tried to make his service smaller than it was. He had hauled the weight of an army across France. At home he was expected to step aside. That contradiction does not soften with time. It sharpens. Because the road in France had already proven what the army was slow to admit. The men it pushed to the margins had carried the center. Years later, Walker's nephew asked him what the war had sounded like. Not what it looked like, what it sounded like. Walker thought about aircraft, shells, sirens, men shouting in the dark. Then he shook his head. Mostly engines, he said. Engines and men trying not to fall asleep. That was not a poet's answer. It was the truth. The war people remember in photographs was often decided by the war that could be heard before sunrise. Engines warming in the cold, convoys forming, a mechanic slamming a hood shut, chains tightening, drivers climbing into cabs, a dispatcher reading route numbers off a clipboard, a man checking the fuel cans behind him and knowing that if one bullet found them, his truck would become a furnace. Then the engine caught, and the road lived again. The GMC CCKW did not defeat Germany because it was beautiful. It defeated distance because it was available. It defeated breakdown because it was repairable. It defeated panic because it was replaceable, and it defeated the myth of elite warfare because it carried ordinary men, ordinary supplies, and ordinary decisions to the exact place where history was waiting for them. Germany built weapons that inspired fear. America built a road system that refused to stay dead. In the end, that was the more terrifying machine, not the truck, the promise behind it, that if one engine failed, another would start. If one road closed, another would open. If one load burned, another would move before the smoke was gone. The deuce. And a half did not win the war by looking important. It won by arriving again and again, and again until the army that worshipped the spearhead finally